Apartment 302 is never alone. It all started when I finally decided moving on my own. I was fed up with life with my parents and also for having a space that I could call mine. After months of looking for a place within my budget, I ran into apartment 302. The price was absurdly low for a place in the heart of the city center, and when I asked why, real estate people just smiled, mentioning that the building was old and that most of the tenants had moved in while renovations were being carried out. I did not pay attention to them. For me, it was the perfect opportunity to have my independence. An empty building meant peace and silence, or at least that's what I thought. The first day was normal. I unpacked and enjoyed being alone. The apartment was a bit dark, and I had that smell of moisture, typical of places that have been empty a long time, but it didn't bother me. At night, I got into bed with a strange feeling, as if something was out of place, but I thought it was due to the excitement of the move. The first night was quiet, although I remember sometime in the early morning, sure I had heard a knock. I stood still listening. Silence was absolute, beyond the sounds, far from traffic. Eventually I went back to sleep. It was on the second night when things started to get weird. I was lying down watching TV when I heard what looked like in the hallway outside my apartment. I got up waiting to see a worker or neighbor, but when I opened the door there was no one there. The corridor was dark and the lights flickered strangely. I thought it might have been an echo of the building, since he was old, and I became convinced that it was nothing important. I locked the door and went back to my bed. That night was more disturbing. The steps returned, but this time not only outside but on my roof, right in the apartment above mine, 402. The strange thing was that the real estate agent had been clear when the 402 was empty, sealed even due to renewals. The sounds were very clear, as if someone was walking slowly from one side to the other. My skin bristled, but I tried to calm down. It's an old building, I said to myself. Sound can travel strangely. However, on the third night, I could no longer ignore what was happening. That night I woke up from a disturbing sleep. In it I walked through the corridors of the building, but every time I tried to get to my apartment, the door was farther away. I felt that something was following me, a cold presence that never showed itself. When I finally woke up, sweaty and heartbroken, I heard something that froze my blood, blows, as if someone was gently touching the wall next to my bed. I stood still, holding my breath. The beats continued to be slow and rhythmic, as if someone was waiting for an answer. Gathering courage, I knocked back, half hoping it was a joke, that the workers were making repairs at that unusual time. But what happened next froze me. After my stroke, everything remained silent. For a moment I thought it was all over, but then I heard an answer. 3 slow knocks on the wall, exactly in the same place as mine. I felt a lump in my throat and got out of bed, looking for something to defend myself with. I armed myself with a floor lamp. Breathing with difficulty, I approached the wall. It was impossible. There was no one in the apartment with you. I had checked it out when I moved in. The apartments on that side were empty and sealed. The next morning I called the real estate agent. I told him what I had heard, waiting for him to tell me that someone had entered the building, or that it was a repair, that I had not been informed. However, its tone changed, became an elusive. Said that she had no idea what might be going on, but that the building, although it was in the process of renewal, had a long and complex history. Left me with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that something was not right. That night I decided to leave the lights on. I sat in the living room with the television in the background, trying to keep myself distracted. But around 2 o'clock in the morning, the lights began to flicker, and the television made a strange static sound before shutting down completely. At first I thought it was a blackout, but when I looked out the window, all the other street lights were on. Only my apartment seemed affected. That's when I saw it. In the turn-off TV pocket, something moved behind me. Was not a human mirror. Was a dark, deformed shadow, sliding down the corridor. My heart started beating out of control. I didn't have the courage to turn around. I could only look at that blurry mirror as the shadow slowly approached to where I was sitting. I felt how the temperature of the room dropped, and a nauseating smell filled the air, something similar to rotten meat. Suddenly the lights came back on, and the shadow disappeared. I was left without daring to move out of the chair. I did not sleep that night. In the days that followed, activity became more intense. Closet doors opened by themselves. The appliances would turn on and off, and I always felt that someone was watching me. But the worst came one night, when I woke up to feel something about myself. I could not move, was completely paralyzed. I felt a cold weight on my chest, as if something invisible was squeezing me, preventing him from breathing. My eyes were moving frantically around the room, looking for something to explain what was going on. That's when I saw it. Standing in the dark corner of my bedroom, there was a tall and thin figure. Humanoid era, but not human enough to look normal. His skin was grayish and his face was deformed, with dark eyes that shone in the gloom. Had no mouth, but somehow I felt he was talking to me, whispering in my mind. I don't know how, but I managed to regain control of my body. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, but the air around me was feeling thick, as if I were moving through water. The whispers in my mind got louder, like that thing is trying to stop me. But finally, I managed to get out of the apartment, and I stayed all night in the car shivering. The next day, I packed what little I had and left without looking back. I never returned to 302. I tried to find out more about the place, but the more I researched, the more I understood that the building had a dark history. It is said that in the 1970s a family lived in 402. No one knows exactly what happened, but they found all the dead members, as if something had consumed them from the inside. Since then, every tenant who has lived in these apartments has experienced similar things: shadow noises, nightmares, and in some cases disappearances. I still have nightmares. I keep seeing that shadow in the dark corners of my dreams, and sometimes when I stay up late, I swear I hear those bangs again, soft and rhythmic, as if something is waiting for it to come back. The reflection of the shadows. My name is Javier, and what I am going to tell you is not a story I heard at some meeting, nor a myth transmitted between friends. It's something I experienced, something that's me to this day. Sometimes I wonder whether I should have heeded the warnings, if I could have avoided all this. But it is too late. This is my story. It all started when I moved into a new apartment. I was excited. It was a comfortable downtown location and, best of all, my own first place. As always, I liked Vintil. I decided to decorate my house with antique objects I found in flea markets and antique stores. I loved to think that these objects had history, that had passed through many hands and lives before reaching me. But now I know that some stories should never continue. A Saturday, while walking through an antique market, I saw something that immediately caught my attention. It was a huge mirror of carved mark, with a dark wood and sizes that seemed to tell an ancient story. The figures in the frame were grotesque, elongated faces and demonic twisted bodies. Although it caused me a slight discomfort, I was also attracted to its The seller is an elderly, serious-looking man. Watched me in silence as I examined the corpse. I finally approached to ask the price, and he looked at me with an expression I still can't forget. This boy has passed through many young hands, he told me in a low tone, as if I didn't want anyone else to hear it. Has brought problems to those who owned it before. If you decide to take it at your own risk. At that moment I laughed for I thought it was just a sales. A way to make it seem more special, more affordable. It was an impressive old and unique find and I wanted it. I paid the man and took him home, without paying further attention to its warning. That same night, I hung the mirror on the main wall of my living room. It was the perfect place for such an imposing piece. Everything seemed normal, even though there was something in the mirror that disturbed me. It was difficult to explain, but the mirror looked darker, denser. I decided it was only the light in the room, and I didn't think about it anymore. During the first nights, the apartment was silent, as usual. One night while lying down watching TV, I noticed something strange in the mirror. At first I thought it was my imagination, or the effect of the flickering light on the screen, but it was not. The shadows in the mirror did not correspond exactly to those in the room, were longer, deeper, as if something was moving inside them. I approached the mirror with more attention. Something in the frame seemed to change, as if the sizes had moved slightly, distorting. I got a little scared, but I tried to convince myself that it was just playing a trick on us. But that was the first sign. As of that night, the strange incidents began to multiply. At the beginning they were just little things, an uncomfortable sensation of being observed. When I was alone in the living room, the lights that flickered for no apparent reason, reflections in paradise, were beginning to look more distorted. But every time I tried to focus, everything was back to normal. What made me doubt what I was seeing? Things started to get more sinister. One night while dining in front of the television set, I heard a slight crunch from the chest. I looked quickly, and for a brief moment, I saw something moving in the mirror. It was not my mirror or the usual shadows. It was something more. A shadow moving behind me in the mirror. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The atmosphere of the apartment changed. That night the air felt denser. I couldn't sleep any colder, feeling that something or someone was watching me. I decided to ignore it, convinced that it was the stress of work or the lack of sleep while I was playing with my mind. But that didn't last long. Things were getting worse and worse. One morning I woke up, and I discovered that the mirror was slightly tilted, as if someone had pushed him. It was impossible, me playing alone, and there were no earthquakes nor vibrations that could have caused that. I set him up again, trying not to panic. That night, what happened left me completely terrified. I was asleep when something woke me up. It was as if someone had whispered my name. I opened my eyes all at once, but everything was dark and silent. I looked around the room, but I didn't see anything strange. When my eyes noticed the mirror in the living room, I froze in the mirror. I saw a dark figure standing at the door of my room. It was not a reflection of something in the house, but a figure that only existed in the universe. I got up with a jump and turned on all the lights, my heart beating hard. The figure disappeared immediately, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, with the lights on and looking at the mirror out of the corner of your eye, fearing that thing would reappear. After that night, things became even more frightening. The shadows inside the mirror began to move more evidently. Sometimes I would see figures walking around the room, but only in paradise. At first I thought I was losing my mind, but everything was too real. There was something inside the mirror, something that was becoming more and more apparent. The feeling that he was not alone in my own apartment was unbearable. I began to investigate the origin of the poison. I found out that the salesman had not lied to me. That property had belonged to several families, and they had all reported strange phenomena, unexplained illnesses, disappearances, and worst of all, deaths. It was said that the mirror was cursed. That served as a gateway between this world and something much darker. One night, after investigating more than I would like to admit, I decided I had to get rid of the. I could no longer stand it. I pulled him down from the wall and took him to the basement of the building, with the intention of leaving it there to decide what to do with it. But just as I deposited it in the dark, cold basement, something came out. I felt an intense cold snap. Colder than I had ever felt. It was as if the temperature had dropped all at once. And then I heard something. It was a low, scrape-high whisper coming from the chest. "You won't get rid of me so easily." Fear invaded me so that I ran out of there. I found the corpse in the basement. I locked myself in my apartment but could not sleep. That voice was me in the mind, and I knew it wasn't over. The next morning I went back to the basement, determined to destroy the castle, but when I arrived I was no longer. I asked the building managers, but nobody knew anything. Had simply disappeared. Since that day something has been following me. I feel his presence in every cell in my house, in every paradise I find. I no longer dare to look too long in mirrors, because every time I do, I see that figure, that dark shadow watching me from the other side, waiting for me to make a mistake. I know I'm not done with that what I saw is still there, stalking, looking for a moment to demonstrate again. And every night when the lights go out, I feel something is moving in the dark corners of my apartment, something that comes from the other side. The House of Whispers. My name is, and what I am about to tell is real. Just a few months ago my life changed forever, and not in the way I would have liked. It all started when my partner and we decided to move to the city, looking for a quieter place, an escape from stress. What we did not know is that the place we choose would bring us something much worse. We had found an old house, huge and beautiful, that was being sold at a price that looked like was a two-story colonial house, with high ceilings and a courtyard overlooking a forest. The curious thing was that the house had been empty for a long time. The real estate agent told us that it had been restored several times, but that for some reason, the owners did not stay long. We did not give it importance. We were excited to begin a new phase. The house was just what we were looking for: spacious, isolated, and with a story that added an air of mystery to it. The first few days in the house were quiet. There was some humidity in the air and a feeling that the house had not been inhabited in a long time, but that was to be expected. It took us a couple of weeks to unpack and ourselves to the place. However, one night, after having finished organizing the last of the rooms, we noticed something that started to make us nervous. We were in the living room ready to go to sleep, when we hear a slight crunch from the second floor. We ignored it at the beginning, thinking it was just the house settling down, as is often the case with old houses. But soon the crunch became something more. Slow steps, as if someone were walking carefully down the corridor on the second floor. We were paralyzed. My partner Laura looked at me with her eyes wide open. "You heard that," I felt. But I tried to downplay it. I climbed the stairs to investigate. The hallway light was dim, and as the air progressed it felt. I checked each of the rooms, and for my relief, there was nothing and no one. I found no explanation for these steps, but the cold in the hallway was palpable, much more intense than in the rest of the house. I came down again and told Laura that there was nothing there. "You have to calm it down," but inside me something was not feeling right. Things started to get stranger. As of that night, a few days later, while we were having dinner, we heard what sounded like whispers coming from the walls. At first I thought it was the wind, but there were no open windows and the sound was too sharp, as if someone was talking from the other side of the wall. Laura also heard it. I got up to try to follow the sound, but every time he approached me he seemed to move. It was as if those whispers were moving around the house, always out of my reach. That night while we were lying down, I woke up suddenly with the feeling that someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and through the gloom, I saw a dark shadow in the corner of the room. I froze. I was tall, taller than a normal person, and although it had no definite features, he felt his gaze fixed on me. I wanted to move to wake Laura up, but I was paralyzed. Suddenly the shadow disappeared. I spent the rest of the night with my eyes open, sleeping bag. The next day, I decided to do a little more research on the house. I started talking to the neighbors. I need to find out if someone else had noticed something strange. What I discovered left me frozen. An older man, which led a few houses below, told me that the house had belonged to a family more than 50 years ago. At the beginning, the family was very reserved, but after a few months, changes began to be noticed. The neighbors heard screams at night and saw strange lights in the second-floor windows. One day, the family disappeared without a trace. The bodies of the parents were found weeks later in the forest behind the house, but the youngest son was never found. The man stared at me with an evident fear in his eyes. Since then, the house has had no peace. Said something was stuck there. My stomach turned, but I decided not to say anything to Laura. I didn't want to scare her any more than she already was. However, what happened that night was something that not even my worst nightmares can anticipate. We were asleep when the sound of a loud bang awakened us. It seemed as if something very heavy would have fallen on the top floor. I ran up the stairs, and upon reaching the second floor, I saw something that left me petrified. The doors of all the rooms were open. Even though we had closed them before going to sleep, the lights in the hallway flickered, and the air was freezing. My heart was beating hard in my chest. I entered the room at the end of the hallway, the one we had decided not to use because she always felt strangely cold. The door was wide open, and the temperature in that room was unbearably low. When I entered, I saw something I will never be able to forget. In the corner of the room, the shadow I had seen before was standing, much more defined this time. Was a human figure, but something was terribly wrong. Was too tall, too thin, and her presence was oppressive. I felt like if the air had been sucked out of the room, and a primitive fear took hold of me. Suddenly the shadow began to move, slowly advancing towards me. I wanted to run, but my legs did not respond. Was frozen in place. I just looked away from that thing. That was getting closer and closer. At that moment I heard a whisper, the same one I had heard before, but this time it was clear. Was a distorted male voice, as if it came from another time. Help me. Just before the shadow came to me, the door to the room slammed shut. I collapsed on the floor, feeling how the air returned to my lungs. Without a second thought, I got up and ran down the stairs. Laura was waiting for me in the living room, pale and terrified. I told him what I had seen, and without wasting time, we decided to leave the house that same night. We stayed at a nearby hotel, and the next day, we called a real estate company to get rid of the house as soon as possible, no matter the cost. All I wanted was to get away from that damn place. Before we leave for good, I talked to the neighbor again who had told me the story of the house. I asked him if I had heard about the missing child. His face became darkened, The child was never found, he told me. Some say his spirit is still in the house, trapped looking for a way out. Others believe something else caught him there. I never knew for sure what that shadow was, nor what really happened in that house so many years ago. But what I do know is that it wasn't just a story. The house was alive somehow, inhabited by something dark and twisted. Since then, every time I close my eyes, I see that shadow. I feel his presence even though I am no longer in the house. I wonder if living there, we opened a door that should never have been opened. Because although I am no longer in the house, I can't escape what I saw. And in the darkest nights, I still hear whispers in my dreams. The attic ritual. My name is Fernando, and if there is anything I have learned in the last few months, is that aggression can be a doom. I'm not the type to create ghosts, demons, or the beyond. Or at least it wasn't. What you told me changed forever, the way I see the world and what I saw in that house. In that attic, it continues to me to this day. It all started when my parents passed away in a car accident and inherited his house, an old mansion on the edge of the city. They had lived there since before I was born, but I was never particularly close to them. The house had always given me a strange feeling. Every time I visited her in my childhood, there was something on its walls, something that seemed to keep an eye on us. But like any adult who tries to leave behind his childhood fears, I had as a simple childish impression. The house was huge, with long corridors and rooms that looked empty, even when they were full of furniture. Had an air of abandonment, as if time had not passed on it in decades. I decided to move for a while, at least as long as he decided what to do with the property. The first few days were quiet. Spent most of the time organizing my parents' belongings and checking the rooms. But there was an area of the house that I always avoided, the attic since childhood. I had listened to my parents speak softly about that place as if they didn't want me to know too much. They said that the attic was cursed. Even in my youth, I remembered hearing how they refused to go up there, as if something terrible had happened. But they never gave me details. Of course, my adult logic, he told me that all these were family stories. That persistent feeling that something was not right was still lurking there. I ignored my own concerns during the first few weeks, but then the incidents began. It all started with small sounds, slight crackling noises on the walls, or that echoed through the long corridors. Always seemed to come from the attic area, but every time I tried to explain it, told me it was an old house, and old houses make noises. But these sounds were too specific, too accurate to make. The simple reflection of wood was as if something or someone was moving above me. One day while in the kitchen preparing dinner, I heard a loud knock. It was as if something had fallen on the top floor, right over my head, where the attic was located. My heart flipped, but I tried to ignore it. The blows continued to be stronger and more persistent, as if something is trying to get my attention. I finally decided to face my fears. I took a flashlight and I climbed the stairs leading to the attic. The attic door was stuck, but with some strength I managed to open it. The air there was heavy, wet, and intense cold immediately enveloped me. The place was covered with dust, as if no one has set foot there in years. However, what I found inside was much worse than I had imagined. The attic was full of antiques that I didn't remember seeing before. There were mirrors covered by old sheets, books and languages I didn't recognize, and worst of all, in the center of the attic a kind of altar was rudimentary, made of dark wood, and on it there were strange symbols hidden. The symbols were like spirals and deformed figures, but the scariest part was what was above the altar. A doll. Was not just any doll. Was made of rags and wires, with a crooked face and dark spots on her cloth that looked like dried blood. Around him were black candles, turned off but worn out. My body tensed instantly. Everything on that altar was screaming that it shouldn't be there, that what my parents had tried to hide. It wasn't just a story. While exploring the attic, a nauseating odor began to permeate the air. It was like rotten meat, as if something was decomposing up there. But there was nothing to explain to that stench. The cold became more intense, and I felt how an icy breeze came through the attic, although there were no open windows. I decided to go down quickly, but just before I left I heard a whisper. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if someone had spoken directly in my ear, although he was all alone. The voice was rough, old, and although I did not understand the words, the tone left me frozen. Something moved behind me. I turned around quickly and lit up with the flashlight. But there was nothing. Or at least that's what I thought. The following days, the situation worsened. The lights were constantly flickering, and the smell in the house became unbearable. The attic seemed to be alive. I began to hear whispers at night, always coming from there. The sound was weak but clear, as if someone was uttering words, in a language I did not understand, full of hatred. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't help it. Had awakened something. One night everything reached a critical point. I woke up around 3 in the morning, feeling a weight in my chest. I could not move. I felt something was in the room with me. My eyesight confronted the darkness, and when I looked towards the foot of the bed, I saw a dark figure, humanoid but twisted. Had no face, only a dark void, and his arms were too long, grotesquely pressing on the sides. I was motionless, but his mere presence terrified me. Then out of his formless mouth came a whisper. "You should not have come." I tried to paint, but my voice wouldn't come out. The figure slowly approached. His presence felt like physical pressure in my body, as if the air itself was being crushed. Then disappeared. The weight on my shoulder rose, but the terror was still there. It was clear that something in the house, I didn't want it to be there. I decided to contact someone who could help me. So I spoke to an expert in paranormal phenomena that a friend had recommended to me. He came to the house the next day, and after a quick inspection, told me what I was most afraid of. Something very dark and ancient was present at the site. I mentioned the attic, and he turned pale when he heard it. "You should never have gone in there." He told me something in that place was convened, and now that you've disturbed him, he's awake. Explained to me that the altar in the attic, it wasn't just decorative, was a point of invocation. Some ancient and evil force had been summoned in that house, and upon entering the attic had awakened that presence that was now stalking me. Recommended that I leave the house immediately and to perform a ritual to seal whatever was that had been released. But there was a warning. That presence was already linked to me. I decided to follow his advice, and I left the house that same night. Since then I have been living somewhere else. But what I found in that house has not left me alone. Sometimes in the dark of the night, I still hear those whispers. I feel that presence, that faceless figure watching us from the shadows. I don't know if I'll be able to get rid of what I woke up in the attic, but what I do know is that this house is built, and whatever dwells in it is not over with me. I should never have gone up to the attic.